In Habakkuk chapter 2, verses 12 to 20, we read these words. Woe to him who builds a town with blood and founds a city on iniquity. Behold, is it not from the Lord of hosts that peoples labor merely for fire and nations weary themselves for nothing? For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And woe to him who makes his neighbors drink. You pour out your wrath and make them drunk in order to gaze at their nakedness. You'll have your fill of shame instead of glory. Drink yourself and show your uncircumcision. The cup in the Lord's right hand will come around to you, and utter shame will come upon your glory. The violence done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, as will the destruction of the beasts that terrified them. For the blood of man and violence to the earth, to cities and all who dwell in them. What profit is an idol when its maker has shaped it, a metal image, a teacher of lies? For its maker trusts in its own creation when he makes speechless idols. Woe to him who says to a wooden thing, awake, to a silent stone, arise. Can this teach? Behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver, and there is no breath at all in it. But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. Well, we've been in a series, Seeking God, over the summer since the end of June, and it's been a really good series, I think, that has challenged us to see God in every part of our lives, to see his sovereignty and his power and his rule and his glory and his reign over the universe itself, and also on our lives in the everyday. Yet if you had listened to the news lately and seen the suffering and the fighting and the chaos in our world, you might even wonder if God is actually able to be trusted with our lives. I mean, we know he can be trusted. We know that in our heads. But when push comes to shove, we might actually question the validity of that belief in our heart of hearts when the rubber meets the road. I mean, think about it. If the big stuff seems to be out of control, how in the world am I going to be able to trust him with my own life here in Nova Scotia or wherever it is you're from? In fact, a very common question I've heard has been this: if God is so good, why is there so much evil and suffering in the world? And it's a fair question, I think, and maybe it's a question you've even asked yourself. How many times have you questioned God about a tragedy or an accident or some unfortunate event or condition that you may have experienced in the past or are experiencing now, or maybe even have observed somewhere else? I know I've directed those sorts of questions toward God. But what's our go-to statement as Christians whenever we face those times and those moments? What do we usually say? Well, brother, trust in the Lord. And you know what? That's great. That's a great word of advice. However, it can often, I think, come across as, though sincere, almost overused. It's a statement we may say when we're trying to encourage or challenge someone, or when somebody's anxious about a provision that they may be wanting or are lacking. We say it to the terrified young mom as she brings her first child home from the hospital. We even say it perhaps in a slightly different way to the husband who has just lost his beloved wife. What do we say? I'm praying for you. Just lean in on Jesus. Just trust him. And when we're filled with fear, whatever that might be, fear of the future, fear of man, fear of tragedy, fear of COVID, we'll often say, well, just trust God. You can see it on American currency and even on license plates from South Carolina. What does it say? In God we trust. Now, those little words actually do pack a lot of truth in them. But what does it really mean to trust God? I know I want to trust him in all things. And I've talked to enough of you to know that many, if not all of you, would love to just let go of any worry or pain or fear or any kind of angst that you might have in any part of your life, and then to just trust the Lord completely. But the question we might ask is, can we actually experience this angst-free life that I'm proposing? And if so, how is that possible? Can we realize such an amazing way of life? It sounds so good. Well, let me reassure you that yes, it is possible, and not only possible, but assured for those who do choose to trust in God. I'm not saying that all your problems and your sufferings and your challenges go away. And full disclosure, you might actually see troubles increase, especially if you're a disciple of Jesus Christ. However, the miracle is what happens to the heart of a disciple of Christ who trusts in a faithful God, no matter the circumstances in you and the circumstances that you're experiencing around you or see around you. Now, we can learn a lot about how we can trust God from the experience of Habakkuk. Smack dab in the middle of great suffering, this prophet had to learn to trust in God. Now, very briefly, to bring some context to Habakkuk's situation, let me tell you about what was happening at the time. Judah's last four kings up to this point were wicked men who had rejected God, and they had actually oppressed their very own people that they're supposed to look after, and yet they're oppressing them. Babylon invaded Judah twice before, and it finally destroyed it in the year 586 BC. And so here it is now, a time of fear, oppression, immorality, persecution, and lawlessness. Everybody did what was right in their own eyes. The book of Habakkuk itself begins with the prophet crying out to God for an answer to why God's chosen people are allowed to suffer. I'm not going to read it, but you can find it in Habakkuk chapter 1, verses 1 to 4. He couldn't understand why God seemed to be doing nothing about the wickedness in society. Similar kind of question to what we may be asking ourselves even today. He's wondering why God's allowing his own chosen people to go through suffering at the hands of their enemies. And so, troubled by what he saw, he asked some difficult questions of God, like some of the same questions we ask in our world today, such as, why is there evil in the world? Why do the wicked seem to be winning when the rest of us seem to be losing ground? Now, I assume that Habakkuk was expecting an answer, but even if he wasn't, he certainly got one. God essentially states, hey, listen, you wouldn't believe it if I told you. There's a summarization of the verses 5 to 11 in chapter 1 that speaks to this. So Habakkuk then follows up and he says, okay. And he says this in the rest of the chapter, all the way even into verse 1 of chapter 2. He's basically saying, okay, you're God. I concede, but still tell me more about why this is happening. So God then answers him again, and he gives him more information. And then he tells, finally at the end in verse 20 of chapter 2, that the earth needs to be silent before him. Then Habakkuk writes a prayer expressing a strong faith in God even through the trials. And so this is the chapter, or this is the book of Habakkuk. Now, the application to us, the reader of Habakkuk, is that it's okay to question what God's doing, although with respect and reverence, we need to do that. But because the truth be told, it's sometimes not evident to us what's going on. In fact, often it's not evident, especially if we're thrown into suffering for a period of time, or if it seems that popular culture is winning while the church appears to be failing in the battle for the minds and the hearts of the people. But when we stop and we crack open the scriptures and we peer into a book like Habakkuk, we're assured that God is a sovereign, omnipotent God who still has and will always have all things under control. And we see that he's not retired, or he's not even thinking about retiring. He's always at work, and we can trust him in his work because he is who he says he is and always keeps his promises. Even when we can't see it, he's still on the throne of the universe, church. Okay, so far, most of what I just said to you there is found in chapter 1, and that's amazing stuff to know about our current situation. But God continues on into chapter 2 with some more incredible information in answer to Habakkuk's original question. And here God, in chapter 2, tells Habakkuk that although he's going to use the wicked nation of Babylon to accomplish his sovereign purposes with his people, his chosen people, and the Babylonians will flourish for a while, the limit of their success is fixed by God. In other words, they're actually living on borrowed time. Sure, God's people are about to go into captivity under them, but God's chosen people will continue, and ultimately the Babylonians will fall. And listen, if you know your history, you know that Babylon did fall and became nothing but ruins. Okay, so now with this background and this understanding, let's go to Habakkuk chapter 2, verses 12 to 20, which I had just read to you earlier as we began this video. And as we do, understand that the 5 woes that are recorded in this chapter are meant to be seen not only in light of Babylon's destruction, but also as a universal principle in history. And that's this: it teaches us that although evil people and wickedness might flourish for a while, they will one day be called to give an account. Now, in the passage that I had already read, we saw 5 woes. That's not something you want to hear, especially when it's something prophesied about you. However, tucked neatly between the dark gloom of the 3rd and the 4th of the 5 woes is a striking ray of light recorded for us in verse 14, where God says, "For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea." Now, here is why it's such a ray of light, church. Filling the earth with the knowledge of the Lord is something that is only possible when God is in control. which is the first point I wanted to share with you. God is in control. Now, Habakkuk had been worried about the future of God's kingdom as a result of this coming siege by the big, bad, bully Babylonians. God knew Habakkuk's concern, and so he responds by saying, relax, Habakkuk. Your nation's going to be taken captive. Yeah, that's already predetermined. But that's not going to impede my ultimate plan. In fact, it's a part of the plan that I've already ordained. I'm on the throne, remember? And yeah, it'll sometimes look like my purposes in the world has been defeated, but you got to know that that's actually impossible, because I'm continually orchestrating everything that happens toward that great and final day. And get this, when all the earth will be filled with the knowledge of my glory. That's what he's saying there. And you know what that means for us today, don't you, church? God is in absolute control of today's news. God plans very carefully his arrangement for all the world events. He's not in heaven, angst-filled about what's going to happen in the world today or tomorrow. He's not sitting up there on his throne, looking down and going, oops, I never saw that one coming. Not even COVID is an issue for him. God's on the sovereign throne of his universe, controlling each and every event of today's news according to his perfect will. He's presently controlling it, and one day he's going to bring it to its perfect end. This means that things aren't always as they appear to be. Habakkuk thought that it was the astute military strength of the Babylonians that had brought them into world power, but he learned that wasn't the case. God makes clear here that he was the one who had ultimately raised them up for his purposes. You know, the ramifications of this way of thinking are life-changing. This means that when you see the news feed on your Twitter account or your Facebook page, and you watch the evening news or you listen to the radio, you should be doing all of that with kingdom glasses on. Always ask yourself, what's the relevance of this news event to the kingdom of God? What was God doing, for example, when the Taliban forces retook Afghanistan? Or closer to our neighborhood, when riots erupted in downtown Halifax because of the homeless situation? We need to keep learning to ask the question, what's the relevance of this to the kingdom of God? God will always make sure that in the end, all things glorify himself. In fact, God will never let a good mess go to waste. This doesn't mean that in this life we can ever fully fathom all the divine purposes we encounter. In fact, we won't. God's ways are often past finding out, after all. Nor does the knowledge that God is absolutely sovereign in our trials take away the very real misery and pain we feel at those times. I'm not diminishing those, but we must realize that God does have a purpose in everything. God is in control, which is why we can't find security and thus be satisfied in anything else. Which brings us to our second point, and that is that idols don't satisfy. Let's take a look again at verses 18 to 19 in this chapter, where it says this: what profit is an idol when its maker has shaped it, a metal image, a teacher of lies? For its maker trusts in his own creation when he makes speechless idols. Woe to him who says to a wooden thing, awake, to a silent stone, arise. Can this teach? Behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver, and there is no breath at all in it. Now, Habakkuk points out that the idols have no voice. They can't answer the questions being asked. And that's because, why? They have no life, which is why they can't bring any satisfaction, only disappointment and emptiness. In fact, a deep, dark, empty void that can't be filled kind of emptiness. I mean, yeah, granted, they look really good because they're covered with gold and silver. And of course, anything and everything's so polished and shiny and must be good, right? Automatically. To the outward appearance, they're so appealing. They're so beautiful. You could almost fall down and worship these things. They look like they could do anything, except there's no life in them. Of course, we modern Western world Christians see how ludicrous idol worship was. Well, we've come so far, haven't we? As a society, we've come a long way. At least in North America, we don't walk into the average home and see the family idol in the entranceway. So if that's the case, why would I then spend any time at all telling you that idols don't satisfy? That certainly doesn't apply to us, after all, does it? Now, here's why we're spending time on this very point. It's because idolatry or idol worship is not just bound down to idols. Idolatry happens when you find something that you crave or you really want or you enjoy or find satisfaction in, anything that you treasure more than God. That's idolatry. Doesn't mean that we don't treasure things. It doesn't mean that we don't crave things. It doesn't mean we don't need to want things. But when it becomes something that we want to find satisfaction in more than God, that's idolatry. Now, in his book, Counterfeit God, Tim Keller says that an idol, quote, is anything more important to you than God, anything that absorbs your heart and your imagination more than God, anything you seek to give you what only God can give. Now, the problem with idols is that though they can look amazing and shiny and full of promise, they don't fill the void. They can't satisfy the deep longing in the human soul for purpose and identity and fulfillment. Sin is fool's gold that tricks us into thinking it's the real thing. But understand, church, we all have idols in our lives if we aren't making God our everything. And since that's the case, a good question to ask of ourselves is, how can we identify those deceptive idols in our lives? How can you tell if you're worshiping a counterfeit God? Tim Keller continues in the book to say, quote, a counterfeit God is anything so central and essential to your life that should you lose it, your life would feel hardly worth living. So we need to be asking ourselves questions that expose our hearts to see if we're actually putting our security in a counterfeit God. For example, what would happen if you lost your entire life savings? Or what if I lost the house I'd spent all these years paying down the mortgage on? Where does your business or your career rate on the scale of importance? Relationships, whether it be friends, family, spouse, children, grandchildren, or even cats. Now, if any of these are more central and so essential to our lives that should we lose them, we'd hardly feel that life was worth living, then we are idolaters. Then we are looking for security in a counterfeit God. Or think about what you spend your money on most effortlessly. Some people spend too much money on clothes and houses and vacations because their money is serving the idol of human approval. Others sock it all away instead of giving because their money is serving their idol of security. They're looking to money to give them their sense of security. I can look out at the world and know that no matter what happens from now on, I'm secure. Again, we're not looking at and saying that these kind of things in and of themselves are bad, but it's when they become our security. You see, in this case, for those who are socking away the money and looking for money for their security, money is giving them what only God can truly give them. But looking at where you put your money most effortlessly, that's often where you see your idols. Or what unanswered prayer has made you bitter towards God? People who make a certain prayer request their basis for whether or not they'll follow or obey God are actually asking God to give them their idol. If you say to God, I will obey if you give me this, then whatever this is really your God. Your non-negotiable prayer requests are not prayers to your God. They are your God. If your unanswered prayers have actually embittered you toward God, then your problem is not that God has let you down, but it's that you've got an idol. That prayer request has taken God's place in your heart. In fact, you love it more than God. You think you need it more than God. So how do we deal with these idols once we see them for what they are? Idolatry is always ultimately a matter of the heart. People say, I believe in God, I believe he loves me, I believe I'm saved by Jesus Christ, but functionally, the desires of their heart are somewhere else, set on people's approval or money security or something else that you turn to in your life for what only Jesus can give you. Ultimately, dealing with our idols is dealing with what our heart loves. And that's why the answer isn't just a mental identification of your idols and going, okay, that's an idol, that's an idol. Ultimately, you have to actually have a sense in your heart of Jesus's love and grace to a far greater degree than you have ever had before. You need the expulsive power of Christ's love and grace to replace your heart's affections for your idols. It's one thing to know in your head that Jesus loves you, but it's a whole other thing to personally experience a love so powerful that it sets you free from the need of others' approval or your need for money or your need for this or your need for that. Idols are always things that promise you what only Jesus can give you. But what only Jesus can give you must, to some degree, be experienced in your heart's love chamber before it will replace your idols. And that's why we must know Jesus intimately. As our vision statement says, know Jesus, love others, make disciples. As you experience in your heart who Jesus is and what he promises to you and for you in his word, this knowing him intimately begins to bring his promises deep into your heart's affections. It's then you're able to begin more and more to say to your idols of conviction, listen, you're not my life. You're not my security. You do not justify my existence or give my life its meaning. Only Jesus can do that. Or only Jesus can give that. Or only Jesus can be that for me. Finally, we come to what this whole chapter is leading us to, the purpose of this chapter, the foundation for everything else that came before it and will even come after. This chapter is leading us to God himself in verse 20. After all is said and done, when we come before God and experience his glory, we can't help but to worship him. And where do we find him? Well, God's in his temple. And because he's in his temple, because he's at home, we can know beyond a shadow of a doubt that God's alive. And because he's alive, that makes all the difference in the world, church. In verse 20, it says, but the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. You know, we already discovered this. A wooden dead idol can't give you a word of exhortation or encouragement or direction or anything. But listen, there's a God in heaven who is alive and aware and active in our lives. And he knows what is going on. He knows your heartache. He knows your concern. He knows your temptation and your trouble. There is the Lord Jehovah who is in his holy temple. And let all the world keep silence before him. This, by the way, this word silence doesn't mean that we can't come and pray to him or have any kind of communication with him, that we're supposed to stand before him in mute silence. The word is actually used to describe the attitude of coming before the sovereign, omnipotent God in a trustful submission. Listen, church, be encouraged. God is alive and he's in control. He's on his throne, or in other words, you could say that he's in the driver's seat. Meanwhile, idols have no life, no personhood, no personality, no power. They're just empty chunks of stone or wood. Temples built to idols are equally empty. No one lives there. But listen, the Lord is in his holy temple. That means he's real. He's alive. And not only that, he's powerful. Idolaters command their idols to save them, but we who worship the living God come to him in silent awe, great respect and reverence, in a trustful submission. We acknowledge that God is in control and that he knows what he's doing. Meanwhile, idols remain silent because they just can't answer. The living God, by contrast, speaks through his living word that he's given us. God's on his throne and his purposes continue to unfold as he's planned. We then wait silently in humble submission before him to hear what he has to say next, because his word is our life. So here's a question I want for all of us to ask. Do we live that way? Do I live that way? Or do we continually live in ways that affirm our lack of trust in him, where I put all my trust in my job or my family or my future plans or even my fun? We gather together on Sunday evenings and we say, the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. And you know what? That sure sounds good. It's great. And it's very nice to start our worship that way. But when we begin our day on Monday morning and we can't or don't say, the Lord is in my daily routine, let all the earth keep silence before him, then the facts are that we really aren't worshiping Jesus on Sunday, because there's no such thing in heaven as Sunday worship unless it's accompanied by Monday worship and Tuesday worship and so on. You see, church, we are the temple of God today. We function as the dwelling place of God. We are his base of a powerful operation in the earth. And so we must live every day and each day and every moment as his representatives on earth, because we're his home address. And that means too that because we're his dwelling place, no one who is a disciple of Christ is ever alone. He will never leave us and he will never forsake us, which tells us that we can trust in God because he is faithful. You know, today we live in a noisy world. Many people can't even drive without music blaring from their car, boom, 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 or the beat of the bass vibrating their vehicle. Even many church services are marked more by noise than by quiet reflection. In ancient times, the pagans cried out in a noisy frenzy to their idols. In sharp contrast, the psalmist saw the wisdom of silence, because in quiet reverence, God can be heard. In the stillness of the night under a starry sky, or in a hushed sanctuary, or in a quiet room at home, we can meet the living God and we can hear him speak. So ask yourself, have you idols in your life? I mean, have you? Let me put it another way. You might say, of course, I don't have idols in my life. What do you think I am, a pagan? We're not savages. Well, let me ask you this question. Has Jesus got all of you? If we are the temple of God himself, we should consider how the presence of God affects what we do and say. How do we behave when we sense his presence? How is his presence in the bodily temple scene lived out here at LifeBridge Church, or in whatever church community you are part of? If he's actually here, how should we then live? What message of his do we listen to while in his presence? What does he want us to learn and then deliver? Do we listen to hear his voice and obey when we hear? This week, church, put on kingdom glasses and see God in his temple in all your actions and in your reactions. For Habakkuk, the message was clear. Stop complaining, stop doubting. God is not indifferent to sin. He's not insensitive to suffering, and he certainly isn't inactive. He's in control, he's alive, and he's faithful. In his perfect time, God will accomplish his divine purpose. Habakkuk was to stand in humble silence, a hushed expectancy of God's intervention and God's action. Well, we need to learn to stand in humble submission to God's will in our lives as a people as well, church. We need to know Jesus, to really know Jesus, to love others and make disciples. And as we do, reflect to the world the living, faithful God who is worthy of all our worship, praise, and our trust.